the day off. Well, at least you weren't here, so, you know. I don't know what else you were doing. Maybe you're working on another class or doing work or something. But good to see you all. Okay. That done. Please remember that quiz number 2 is due tomorrow night, the end of the day. So please try to get it done if you haven't done it yet. Okay. There she is. Well, take care of this or not, because that's stupid thing. Okay. All right. Who was Jesus Christ? Yes, I think I was looking at my schedule of readings. I was freaking out because I thought I was really far behind, but I think I'm only one class behind, which is pretty good because I thought I had talked too. Well, I have talked too much on certain things. But so I'll cover some stuff. Hopefully, I can get it done today. Well, I'll say hopefully. Cognitive behavioral therapy, right? I will get it done, right, Miss Parley? I will get it done, okay? But I'll have to cut out some things, and whatever I don't cover, as I've told you before, I won't test you on. But I talked about of covering the main points, which is the Messiah. Okay, all right. I was talking about King David, and the Messiah is a descendant of King David. We had a little discussion about that. Not assuming that you're thinking about the course on your days off, but did anyone come up with a theory of how Jesus could be a descendant of King David when he wasn't the biological son of Joseph? Anyone? Maybe ask your pastor on Sunday or your the priest. Your priest, your minister, anybody? Cousin who went to Bible college? Couple of Mormon missionaries that you saw on the street? Oh. Well, Jesus was the biological child of one person. Who was that? Who was that? Mary. Hello, Mr. Hinkle. Mary, Miriam, this Palestinian Jewish woman, okay? Virgin birth. She did not have sexual activity, but he was conceived of her. So he was at least biologically related to one human being on the planet, right? This Palestinian Jewish woman with the name of Mary or Miriam. He was not, as was thought, the father of Joseph. Joseph did not have sexual relations with Mary to produce Jesus, nor did she have sexual relations with somebody else. So she didn't commit adultery, or she wasn't raped or something like that. It was apparently a miraculous or an unusual event, supernatural event. But Joseph was of the house of David, yes? He was a descendant of David. Yes? As we discussed? Yeah. So when he... Mr. Roston. Already? If you have to go to the bathroom that quickly, why not just go before? Actually, why don't all of you just go before? Because you know you're going to have to go. Not all of you, but some of you, you know who you are, you know. Just go before.
Why are you looking at me? I went before.
Oh, no, I'm not looking at you. I'm asking you. I'm just asking you. Well, I didn't need to know that, but sorry. So Joseph married Miss Roberts. Mary. Yes? Right, Ms. Jones? Joseph married Mary. Okay, she became his wife. And even though, typically in a Jewish marriage, sexual relations would be part of it, but It didn't matter if you had children or not. Okay, the contract, once the contract of marriage was made, she was already Joseph's wife, and that's how she's described in like the Gospels. She's already called Joseph's wife, even though they were just betrothed at the time, they were engaged. But in the ancient world, engagement is almost the same as the marriage ceremony. So she was already considered Joseph's wife. That's why it would have been an act of adultery, and why she would have been subject to the law. So Jesus is only a descendant of King David through Mary's marriage to this man Joseph of Nazareth, yes? That's the only connection. If Joseph wasn't the father, Ms. Wanamaker, the biological father. God bless you. Because Jesus is directly related to this woman Mary, and she was the wife of this man Joseph, who was a descendant of King David. Now we can have a claim of Jesus, a legitimate claim of Jesus being also of the house of David, because his father, not his real father, his biological father, but Joseph was considered his, for all intents and purposes, his father. Make sense? Make sense? No? Well, it makes sense to me. Well, anyways, makes sense to most people. However, this leads to another question that I might throw out there. Doesn't that make Mary a very special woman? Because she's the connection. Without her, Jesus is not a descendant of anybody, because he wouldn't have been incarnated, he wouldn't have been conceived. But even if he were conceived, he wouldn't have been he couldn't have claimed to have been a descendant of this ancient king of the Jews. So his whole messiahship, Mr. Tedeschi, goes up in smoke without her. She sounds, I don't know about you, she sounds to me like she's a very important part of the story. Think about them. I don't know. You go into some Christian churches on Sundays, and when's the last time you heard them preach a homily about her, or a sermon, or mention her at all, or even have pictures of her to honor her? Not statues. Statues is maybe too pagan for some Christians, but pictures? Go into some churches, they've got all pictures of the previous pastors on the wall, as you pass in and stuff like that. Pictures of the prophets, the apostles. Not one picture of the mother of Christ in some Christian churches. Like she didn't exist. He's a ghost. Anyways, I was talking about David. Where does this idea come from? Well, I was ending on the point that in 2 Samuel, David's son, who's a prophet, comes to him and says, David, you want to build a temple for me, a house, but I'll build a house for you, a house that will never end. Metaphor, I don't think God was literally going to, it's not like, Michael Holmes or somebody, HGTV, out there, some guy going to renovate a house, or he's a construction worker, he's a general contractor. Although God did build the world in 6 days, so he has experience. No, he's speaking metaphorically, I think. The house, meaning your descendants will rule over Israel forever. And so that promise is famously made in the second book of Samuel, chapter 7. However, nevertheless, it's also given to us, a version of it is given to us in Psalm 89, the book of Psalms, and 1 Chronicles chapter 17. But whoever wrote the books of Chronicles is basically copying the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. All right, so Chronicles is kind of a repeat. There's some new stuff in it, but it's a later work that's based on the books of... So it's basically almost exactly the same in 1st Chronicles. But Psalm 89 is not. And some scholars argue, I don't know how you prove this, but some scholars argue that this might actually be the more original form of the oracle that was given to Nathan, and that was then I guess because they serialized in the book of Samuel, made more prosaic. Anyone like to read from this, from Psalm 89? Anybody? Am I having pissed off in this class yet? Oh, Ms. Walker.
How far down the road?
Read the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah, please. Do you want to come up?
No, it's okay. I'm just
Okay.
I will sing of your mercy forever, Lord. I will proclaim your faithfulness through all ages. For I said, my mercy is established forever. My faithfulness will stand as long as the heavens. I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant. I will make your dynasty stand forever and establish your throne through all ages. Then you spoke in vision to your faithful one who said, I have set a leader over the warriors. I have raised up a chosen one from the people. I have chosen David, my servant, with my holy oil I have anointed.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm not giving you the whole psalm, but verses 2 to 5, and then I skipped the verses 20 to 21. Okay, so yeah, this is very similar to the prophecy that's given in what did I say, 2 Samuel. I'm losing my mind. Anyways, so there's obviously a connection. Well, at least the belief is there. Certainly, the belief is there of some kind of promise to the Davidic dynasty, to this King David, that he has a special relationship with God. Okay, so just as God is merciful forever and God is faithful forever, this is an agreement that will last forever. Though it doesn't. Just go with it, Ms. Peralty. Just go with it right now, all right? God's a big promiser. You got to understand that about God. Makes big promises, hey, Jesus, go down, be amongst my people. Nothing will happen. Wink, wink. Anyway, a covenant. Yes, a covenant, a contract. He's making another covenant, a covenant within a covenant. Because remember, I talked about covenant before. God makes a covenant with all of the people of Israel, every Jew, to be their God. But he's making a specific covenant, agreement, contract with David, who is now, he's calling him my chosen one. God bless him. My chosen one. Which is interesting, because if you read this terminology, chosen one, if you read the Gospel of Luke, for example, when Jesus, is it the baptism? I think it's the baptism. I'm getting it confused might be getting it confused with transfiguration. Let me just make sure. No, I think it is the transfiguration, actually. Or it could be both, actually. No, because he doesn't describe the baptism. Yeah. No. No, it's the transfiguration. Now I have to remember where it is. Oh, there it is. Right there. Chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, when Jesus goes up a mountain and he's transfigured, he's transformed in front of some of his apostles. Luke chapter 9. And, traditionally the church has interpreted this weird event as, kind of Jesus giving them a glimpse of his glory, of his divinity within his humanity. But whatever. The point is that a voice comes from the heaven, just like at Jesus' baptism, where the voice says, this is my son, listen to him, etc. and so forth. A similar thing happens with this event of the transfiguration, where Jesus is transformed on the mountain. Then from the cloud on the mountain came a voice, probably meaning God. God spoke and said, this is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. Okay? Which is a little bit different if you read the account like in the Gospel of Mark. I don't think, Mark, I think, lacks chosen one. And I'm not looking, don't look. Yes. This is my beloved son in Mark. Listen to him. So Luke changes it. Either he changes it a little bit or he has a different tradition of what was said. But in Luke's gospel, it's my chosen one. Now, is Luke making a connection here to Psalm 89? So, again, making kind of a claim to Jesus' messiahship in a manner of speaking, without calling him the Christ, but using the language of the Messiah that any Jew would probably have known and gotten the hint, that if Jesus is the chosen one like David, he is a servant. Jesus describes himself as a servant of God. The Son of Man has come to serve and not be served. Yes. Okay. And David is my servant. My prophets are also called servants in the Bible. So there's that connection. Yeah. And then it gets more explicit. I put a leader over the warriors. Okay. That's kind of violent. But remember the Messiah, that's where some people thought the Messiah would be a warrior king. I have raised up my chosen one again. I've chosen David, so repetitive here, emphasizes he's chosen. He's my servant, and he has been Messiah, really. If you want to literally translate this, he has been Christed. He has been Messiah. Meshach in Hebrew. Mashiach or Mashach means to anoint with oil. Mashiach means someone anointed with oil. And this is a verbal form. So I have anointed him with oil. I have made him a Christ. Okay. Who would like to read the rest of this on this PowerPoint? Let's see. I got you. You're fine. I got you. What do you got there? You doing it? Oh, okay. Mr. Closer. Yeah, why not? Okay. Do you want someone else to read the other one, or do you want to continue? All right, go ahead. Thank you. Very nice. Right? So, David, shall cry to me, you are my father. Well, yeah, I mean, that's royal language in a lot of cultures, not just the Jews. The king or the ruler was seen as kind of the adopted child of the god. So the Jews were no different in using this imagery. But I think there's something more going on here than just saying, I'm your adopted son, but I am your son in a way. You are my father, my God, the rock of my salvation. He is the firstborn. I will make him the firstborn, the most high over the kings of the earth. Not the highest. I mean, I don't think it's saying like, oh, he'll be the greatest of kings. It's using terminology that is applied typically to God. And that's why I give you that little exclamation points. I give you some examples from other Psalms where it talks about God is the most high. He's in the highest, he's above the heavens, over all the heavens. There are multiple heavens in their idea, it wasn't just one heaven. But God was even above the highest of the heavens. He was the most high. So you've got this kind of divine terminology kind of percolating down or being given to the king in a sense, even though he's still a man. It's not making the king into a god. But the idea is there of a king who is in some way divine. Okay? And then the rest of it is just basically, my covenant will last forever. Okay? Even if his children rebel against me and don't do what they're supposed to do, because of my love for David and my contract with him, my covenant with him, I will still be faithful and his throne will never end. Which doesn't happen. It does end, They do rebel against him. Okay, forget about the date 721 BC, but that just to give you, showing you some map here. The United Kingdom. Well, actually, I do need to mention this. The United Kingdom I showed you on the other map the one kingdom that David ruled over, and then one of his sons, and then one of his grandsons was during when his grandson was king. His grandson was kind of a schlub. So the northern tribes rebelled against him and founded their own kingdom with their own king in 721, or excuse me, 930. 930. Okay, so you had a divided monarchy. You had the Davidic kings ruling in the kingdom of Judah in the south, and then the kingdom of the north was called the kingdom of Israel, which I know can be a little bit confusing, but just go with it, okay? And their capital was, well, it was in Shechem, but I think it eventually ended up in Samaria, the town of Samaria. And they built their own temple as well. They built their own temple in kind of conflict with the temple of Jerusalem. That was a big sticking point. And it didn't survive. It survived for about 200 years, but in 721 BC, an empire up here called the Assyrians. They had Nineveh. Well, there's their ancient capital. They don't show it on this map. I'm concerned with the Babylonians here, but there was an empire up here. Don't worry about it. Called the Assyrians. Maybe I should tell you. It might show up on a quiz question. Modern day Syria. That's where they get the name from. The ancient ones are called Assyrians or Assyria. They come down from the north and invade the kingdom of Israel and destroy it in 721. Okay, but you still have the kingdom of Judah, so you could say, right on, God. You know, your statements are still true because we still have the Davidic monarchy in the kingdom of Judah, but the kingdom of Judah also doesn't last that much longer. Another, maybe, 200 years, I guess, until 587, another empire in the Middle East arises from ancient Iraq, called Babylonia, and the Babylonians come over and they wipe out in 587 BC, they wipe out the kingdom of Judah, destroy the temple in Jerusalem. So that's the 587 is the effective end of the Davidic monarchy. So what do we make of the promise in Psalm 89 and 2 Samuel this week? Yeah, we shrug. Yeah, the Jews kind of like were the same thing. They're like, oh, well. You know? They did not lose faith in their God, though. Okay? The remaining Jew, we don't know what happened to the Jews in the northern kingdom when Assyria exiled. Usually the poor people, no. But the rich people in the middle class, typically when a country or a region was invaded and taken over, you know, the people who were wealthy, the rulers, the middle class, as I said, will be taken away, will be exiled as slaves, as servants, or just dispossessed. Okay, so that, you know, the invaders could have the land. They would leave the poor people alone because, you know, poor people don't have anything that anyone really wants, even back then. So, and they were no threat to them. So, they had no money, they had no possessions. If they had VCRs, they were all like VCRs from like the 80s. You know, which ate up your tapes and stuff. So who wants those? You know, put it on eBay. See what happens. So the poor people, they would leave them. But everybody else, so we don't know what the Assyrians did with all those Jews from the kingdom of Israel. They're lost to us, lost to history. But we do know what happened to the ones in the southern. All the rulers, the wealthy, the middle class were exiled to Babylon to be slaves and servants of the Babylonians. So a large group of people from the kingdom of Judah were forcibly moved over to ancient Iraq, where they lived for about 50 some years, not that long actually, before they were allowed to return in, I believe, the 530s BC. They were allowed to, because Babylon got conquered by another empire, and then the leader of the new empire that conquered them, which was the Persians from Iran, basically said, everyone who's been exiled, if you want, you can go home. So a lot of the Jews decided to go home. But a lot of Jews still stayed in Iraq, actually. But a lot of Jews decided to go home and try to rebuild the monarchy and rebuild the temple. They were able to rebuild the temple, but they were not able to rebuild the monarchy. But that was their desire. Okay? And while they were in Babylon, suffering, living for the next 5 decades, some Jews started thinking about, well, what does this mean for us? You know, God made all these promises, told David that his throne would last forever, told David that even if his descendants were unfaithful, God would still, you know, stay by the contract he made with David. And that didn't happen. The kingdom broke apart, and then, you know, eventually the Davidic kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, was destroyed. And we have no king anymore, no Davidic king. And, you know, that the Jews saw that as punishment for their sins. But again, God says in Psalm 89, even if the people sin or the king sins against me, I'll beat him with a rod, but I won't take away my mercy, you know? But God did take away his mercy, you know, when the Davidic kings did abandon him and were faithless. So how do we interpret that? So what's this idea of a Messiah then? This idea, well, because it failed historically, it didn't. But so they reasoned that God must have not meant it historically, meant it more for the future, a coming Messiah. Okay, not a Messiah, you know, who would come now, be now. Okay, but a Messiah in the future who would do perfectly who would fulfill perfectly the promises of God. That's what must happen. So that hope started to arise of a Christ, an anointed one from the house of David, who would restore the kingdom of Israel and faithfulness to God by restoring the law of Moses sometime in the future. And that would never end. That would be God's final intervention on behalf of the Jews. Okay, now we have to remember something, or we have to know something about the idea of the Messiah. Okay? First of all, not everyone believed in it. It was a late development within Judaism. It happens during the exile, okay, after the destruction of the kingdom of Judah. So the idea of the Messiah starts appearing sometime around the 6th century BC, and maybe even the 400s BC. But even up till the time of Jesus, 400 years later, you know, it still was not an established idea in Judaism, you know. And there were different ideas about what the Messiah was supposed to be. They didn't all share the same, not all Jews shared the same idea of the Messiah. So, for example, you had your 3 views, actually there are 4, as we'll see. First is the political Messiah. There were the kind of the traditional, if you take the prophecies literally, Psalm 89 and the promise in 2 Samuel, take them literally, then you're looking for a warrior king, a leader of the warriors, who is going to come and overthrow Israel's enemies and really reestablish an actual new government that will last forever, ruled by Davidic kings. Okay? So what was a nationalistic idea? The kingdom of God, yes? So when Jesus is preaching about the kingdom of God, that's interesting. What kind of kingdom is Jesus trying to establish? Does he mean a spatial kingdom? Like the political Messiah? Is that the kind of Messiah he wants to be? But then there were those who looked more for a spiritual Messiah, more like a prophet, a prophetic type of Messiah, not a kingly Messiah, but one who would be more like a teacher and a prophet to God's people. He would lead them into a spiritual kingdom. Not really maybe still a physical kingdom in some people's minds, but I think more of a spiritual kingdom that would restore the religious balance. And there is some evidence for this. I don't think I put it on the PowerPoint. Maybe put it in my notes. Well, the book of Numbers. It's in the book of Numbers, but I wanted to see if I put it in my notes. No, it's in Deuteronomy, actually. Still didn't put it in the notes. All right, well, it doesn't. And there is some evidence for this. I'm almost certain it's in the book of Deuteronomy where Moses, the lawgiver, talks about a prophet like me, calls himself a prophet like Moses will be sent to you by God in the future. And some people saw that as a messianic prophecy. So the Messiah is more like a prophet than a king. He's more like a prophet like Moses, who will, so the emphasis there is on the faithfulness to God's law, following God's rules and his will, being righteous. So the spiritual Messiah. And so, like, we have evidence from contemporary Jewish writings from the time of Jesus, Jewish communities that were in existence at the time who talk about they're actually expecting two messiahs, a Christ of David, who would be like the political messiah, but a Christ of Aaron would be like a priestly messiah, almost like the prophet, spiritual messiah, the prophet like Moses. So interesting. And then there was the apocalyptic messiah, apocalypse, and you could also call it the eschatological messiah. I had that word on a previous PowerPoint slide, but I didn't ask you to learn it, but I just gave it to you. But apocalypse means something that's revelatory or uncovered. It means a revelation, but in this sense is being used in the sense of the end times, the end of the world. And another word for the end times is eschatology, eschatological. Whoops, an H here, sorry. Eschatology or eschatological. Because eschatos in Greek means simply the last or ultimate. Okay, so again, the end times, eschatology. They both begin with an E, so you can remember. End times. Apocalyptic means revelatory or revelation, but it's also used to mean the end times. It's not exactly its use, but just go with it. So there were those who believed in an apocalyptic Messiah who would be, again, kind of a prophetic figure, but more in this, not in the mold of Moses, but in the mold of Elijah, this great prophet Elijah. He doesn't even have his own book in the Bible, but he really should. But his story is told in the books of Kings, at the end of the first book of Kings and the first section, or a number of chapters at the beginning of the second book of Kings, talk about this prophet Elijah. And he was believed by some Jews, that he would come back at the end of the world. In fact, Jews still believe this today. Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews still believe that the prophet Elijah, that they'll know when the end of the world is coming, because the prophet Elijah will show up at the Passover meal. So they always leave an empty seat for him, the prophet Elijah, so he can, whichever Jewish house he goes to, can have somewhere to sit. And sometimes they open the door for him as well. They leave the door open. So it's still a belief amongst Jews. But even at the time of Jesus, there was a belief in this apocalyptic or eschatological Messiah like Elijah, who would come back at the end of time and bring about the end of the world. And then that would be the reestablishment of the kingdom, God's sovereignty. I mean, think about if some of you, I think, not my Catholic students, I'm a Catholic too, so I know my people, but some of you might read the Bible. And hopefully all of you, hopefully you've at least read the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, yes? They should have given a paper on the Gospel of Matthew as well. Maybe there's a future change to the syllabus coming. But Mr. Gaffney has put thumbs down on that. Okay, Mr. Gaffney, I got. All right, Mr. Gaffney. All right. No, I wouldn't do that. It's not the syllabus. But even if you just read the Gospel of Mark, which I hope you have, again, the transfiguration that I was mentioning, Jesus is taken. Let's read it. Why not? Who would like to read from Mark's Gospel, the transfiguration of Jesus in Mark chapter 9? children. Your parents do, I crashed the car, Dad. You paid it. All right. We'd like to read Mark chapter 9, Transfiguration of Jesus. I got you. Let's see if we get somebody else, though. I haven't read in a while. Ms. Jones? Oh, go ahead, Ms. Jones. Ah.
What part am I doing?
Chapter 9, start with verse 2 reads. Huh?
Where am I?
I'll let you know. Verse 8. Yeah, that's good to know. It's good to know when you have to stop, right? You don't want to keep reading from the Bible because you never know where it might lead.
And then 16 reading from my long report by the done and by and he was figured for them and his raiment became signers ring.
No, it's what? King James Version, yes? Susan? Okay, go ahead. That's fine. Who? Who appeared? Who? Elijah! And who else? Moses! Miss Bella. Go on. Yeah, go ahead.
And there was a cloud that overspread them, which was all and cloud things. This is not the one here. That is when they had they saw one of the
Wants to continue on from verse 9. Who's Niner? Yeah. Lacey, you want to do that one, please? Thanks.
as they were coming down, he charged them not to relate what he had seen and except in the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter themselves, questioning what Friday from heaven. And they asked him, why do the scribes say that Elijah was first king? He told them, watch over and eat them first and restore all things. Yet, how is it written, by the Son of Man, he must suffer greatly and be treated with him. But I tell you that Elijah has come and he sends to them whenever they do as his friend.
Excellent. And then he goes off and heals, cast out some demon. Okay, interesting. A lot of interesting things going on here. You notice that Moses and Elijah. Should tie a string to all of my sleeves. You know, like when you were younger and your parents, remember they had you on the on not a string, but not that rope, but that thing you could hold on to, and it put the little belt around the kid's waist, and if the kid went too far, you put. That ever happen? Or I'm saying I can't do it to you. Oh, you never had that? So it will be a new experience. But I have to find one that's big enough for 20-some-year-olds or 20-some. I'll look on Amazon. Now it's have to afford like 25 of them. It dog walked. They might have like, I'll see. Moses and Elijah, Mr. Henkel, make their appearance talking to Jesus. Spiritual Messiah, eschatological Messiah. The ideas are there. Why Moses and Elijah? Why did they appear to Jesus talking to him? Although I wonder why David didn't make an appearance as well. Is Jesus, or is there some indication that, God is maybe eschewing the political Messiah, the Davidic Messiah? Or Jesus is as well? I'm more like a prophet like Moses, or a priest like Moses, or a prophet like Elijah coming at the end of time? Is that what the message is? Is that why David is not part of the picture here? I don't know. But Moses and Elijah appear, and Peter, one of Jesus' followers, is like, let's build some tents, shrines to you, to Moses, to Elijah, which was a devotional activity. It's like, you see someone's house, they have a statue of the Virgin Mary in their garden or something, That's a shrine, to honor the person, okay? And Jews did the same thing in the ancient world. They would make little shrines, devotional shrines to someone that they respected. But Peter apparently is placing Jesus on the same level as Moses and Elijah. But what happens? A cloud appears, and out from it seems to come the voice of God, who says, no, this is my son, the one I love. Listen to him. So almost like God is setting them straight. No, Jesus is not an equal to Moses or Elijah. He's my son. Whereas they are not, apparently. I'm assuming God loved both Moses and Elijah, but God doesn't call them beloved. Jesus is the one who's beloved. And then as they're coming down the mountain, again, the Messianic secret, as some of you know, from your papers, the Messianic secret always makes an appearance when it comes to the Gospel of Mark. Anyways, thank you, Wilhelm Reda. Anyways, God tells them, don't tell anyone what you saw about the transfiguration until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. Okay, I'll come back to Son of Man. That's important. Jesus seems to talk about himself a lot as the Son of Man, which is a weird title. What does it mean? But he says, don't tell anyone till I've risen from the dead. So he already mentions the resurrection, but notice what Mark tells us. So they kept the matter to themselves. Peter, James, and John obeyed his word. They didn't tell, apparently, the other apostles. The other, nine? 9 plus 3 is 12, right? 9 plus 2 is 11. Oh, okay. So apparently they didn't tell the other 9 apostles or the other disciples until after the events, the resurrection. But I love it when Mark gives us this little information. They questioned what rising from the dead meant. They didn't know what he was talking about. It wasn't in their mind that the dead would rise. Not everyone believed in it at the time of Jesus. Like the Messiah, it was a late idea that developed in Judaism, again, during the exile. You start seeing in Jewish writings this idea that God will reward the good and punish the bad in the afterlife. There's an afterlife now. It's not just, I think I told you this before, it's not just like this dark underworld where everybody goes, Sheol, okay? Or nowhere. You exist by people's remembrance of you, okay? But there was no afterlife for some Jews, especially if you read some of the early books of the Bible. You start to see this idea develop of an afterlife, which, as I said, not all Jews accepted. Jesus did. He believed in it. But the more traditional Jews did not, because it was a late development. They thought it was unscriptural. They couldn't find it in the Bible, especially like the Sadducees, the priests in the temple. So there's only one time where Jesus is really he knocks heads with the Sadducees only one time, and it's on this question of the resurrection of the dead. I think I read it to you already about marrying more than one way. You know, if a guy marries seven. Did I do that story here? Guy married, hey, Jesus, one guy marries, or seven guys marry one woman, and then when they die, you know, whose wife should be in the afterlife. Did I do that? No. You don't remember? Does anyone remember? I know I did it, but I don't know if I did it in this class specifically. But anyways, don't worry about it. You've read it if you read the Gospel of Mark. But Jesus has, you know, there are a group of Jews that come up to Jesus who don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, and they try to trick Jesus with a trick question. And Jesus slaps them down hard. It's one of the few instances where Jesus is really nasty. And these were priests from the temple, so they were religious, but they were conservatives. Okay, they held to what were the traditional ideas. So, for example, this group did not only apparently accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. They did not accept the other writings that came later. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That was it for them. That was their scripture. Nothing else. They didn't accept the prophets, the books of the prophets, or Psalms or anything. They didn't accept resurrection of the dead. They didn't believe in angels. That was another late development. But Jesus did. Jesus says, yes, God is a God of the living. It's not a God of death. Jesus talks about angels, so he obviously believed in them. He also quotes from the Psalms, the books of the prophets, like Isaiah, so he clearly accepted them as scripture. Okay, but not all Jews did. And so Jesus was, in a sense, more of a liberal in some ways. Not a liberal in the sense where not like, you know, we would think, and wasn't like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you know, kind of liberal, but, you know. But anyways. So what did and they did, so there were not all Jews understood resurrection of the dead or believed in it. So I don't know if that means Peter, James, and John didn't believe in it, but they certainly apparently didn't understand it. It didn't enter their mind about how that could happen, because no one came back from Sheol. No one came back from the dead. And then they asked Jesus about Elijah. Why do the scribes, who are like the theologians, why do they say that Elijah must come first? Okay, and here this is kind of like inside baseball, because they're asked, Mark isn't explaining this. He's assuming that if you're a Jew, you know what they're talking about. And the Jewish belief was that before the end, the prophet Elijah would come back. But I thought they said nobody came back from the dead. He just said nobody came back from the dead, right, Ms. Via? But if you've read the story of Elijah, he didn't die. He was taken up to heaven in a chariot. So technically he didn't die. So he could come back legitimately. So they're asking Jesus, you know, why do the experts say that Elijah has to come back? And Jesus says Elijah will come back. And in fact, Elijah has come back already. And they did to him whatever they pleased. Doesn't sound like it's a very good thing. Who was someone, he doesn't name it, but reading between the lines, who was someone that people did whatever they pleased to? You can think of 2 people from the Gospel of Mark that were done to as people pleased. That Jesus could be referring to. What do you think? Mr. Cummings, what do you think? Gospel of Mark. Out of the characters of the Gospel of Mark, who are 2 people that were done to as men wanted to do, apparently treated badly. I got you. Give Mr. Cummings a second. Jesus. Yeah, I could think Jesus. He could be talking about himself. Yeah, he was arrested and killed unjustly, apparently. Yeah. Who else? Who else was treated unjustly, Miss Walker? Jesus, okay. Yeah, I think that's legitimate. I mean, that's a legitimate answer because he's not specific. He could be talking about himself, the third person. But who else? Who's another candidate who maybe came before Jesus? John? Oh, yes, Miss Burris. John who, though? Do you remember? John the Baptist, because remember there's John the Apostle. Oh, yeah, remember, Jesus had the connection with John the Baptist, who was himself arrested for speaking the truth to power and got his head cut off for it. He might be talking about John the Baptist. Elijah already came before me. So what does that make me? What does that make Jesus? Okay. And then, as I said, there was a fourth view, which was nada. The big nada. Nothing. There were Jews who didn't believe in the Messiah at all. They weren't expecting a Messiah or a Christ at all. What were they expecting? Nothing. Nada. Nothing. It wasn't part of their view. Certainly nobody in any of the records we have from Judaism just before the time of Jesus and even during the time of Jesus, God bless you, no one was expecting a defeated Messiah. I mean, in all these views, forget about the nothing Messiah, but in all these views, political, spiritual, apocalyptic, the Messiah is triumphant. He's overturning the evil forces, whether, defeating them in battle or spiritually destroying the devil's kingdom, stuff like that. No one was expecting a Messiah who would be humiliating, convicted of a crime, and then humiliatingly executed. That wasn't apparently on anyone's radar. Because it doesn't make any sense. How do you make a Hollywood film out of that? Where the superheroes ultimately fail, Although I guess, there's Cabin in the Woods where they ultimately fail. I guess maybe Lord of the Rings, Frodo brings the ring to the Mountain of Doom, Mount Doom, but he doesn't actually end up throwing the ring in. So, I mean, it doesn't seem, I'm not saying it couldn't happen. It's just, or didn't happen. It's just, it would not make a lot of sense that God would send the Messiah to simply be a failure, to fail at his attempt. And certainly no one was painting a story that, oh yeah, we'll have a Messiah who will die, but then God will raise him from the dead. Okay. Why? Why? I mean, think about the logic of what people who were expecting the Messiah were expecting. What did raising Jesus back to life have to do with reestablishing the kingdom of David, establishing the law of perfect practice of the law of Moses, bringing about the end of the world? Did any of that happen? It's a puzzle. Okay. Son of Man. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man twice in that story of the Transfiguration. And this is interesting because, you'll hear some scholars talk about how, Jesus never called himself the Messiah. And I think that's probably true. I don't think Jesus ever came out, was going around telling people, yeah, I'm the Christ. Which would, I don't know, I wasn't there, but it makes sense to me if people had so many diverse views of what it was, or no view at all. It would make no sense to talk to people who don't believe in a Messiah. And no sense to talk to people if, about people who believe in a political Messiah when that's not what you're going to do. You're not going to overthrow the Romans and reestablish a government. But as I think I've shown you already, little ways, Jesus is kind of like with a nod and a wink saying, I'm kind of like the Messiah. Just not what you're expecting. His preferred terminology is Son of Man. Okay, when he refers to himself as a Son of Man, which comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 7 in the Old Testament. In a section that's not written in Hebrew. It's actually, in the book of Daniel, it's kind of odd. It's written in Hebrew up to a point, and then certain sections break off, and for some reason, the author starts writing in Aramaic, which is a related language to Hebrew, but, it's not the same language, clearly. It's like, if I were writing in Spanish and then I broke off and started writing in French. Okay, they're very similar languages. They come from the same source, Latin. but they're very different. You would know one's not the other. So he starts writing in Aramaic, and in Aramaic, there's this prediction of something called a bar anash. Bar means son in Aramaic, and anash means human being, usually translated as the son of man. One like a son of man will come. It's a weird little vision. Daniel has a vision. Take a look at that, chapter 7. I want to start here. Yeah, here we go. Chapter 7, beginning with, I guess, verse 9 is fine. Maybe I want to. Yes, verse 9. Miss Farley, if you're able to get it, if you don't mind reading it, please.
Yeah,
Yes.
Flames of fire, wheels of burning fire. Yeah.
Keep going.
Thousands upon thousands were ministering to him. On myriads stood before him.
Yeah, great number.
The court was convened and the books were opened. I watched then from the first of the arrogant words which the thorn spoke, until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the burning fire. As for the other beasts, their dominion was taken away, but they were granted a prolongation of life for a time and a season. As the visions during the night continued, I saw coming with the clouds of heaven one like a son of man, having reached the ancient of days, and was presented before him. He received dominion, splendor, and kingship. All nations, peoples, and tongues will serve. His dominion is everlasting dominion that shall not pass away. His kingship one that shall not be destroyed.
Okay, then we can stop there. Excellent. So this man Daniel, and this book of Daniel was written around 100 BC, so only about a century before Jesus. It's one of the later books of the Old Testament. There are others like the Book of Wisdom that were written 50 years before Jesus. So, but Daniel's one of the late ones. And it tells the story. It's probably not meant to be literal history. This guy Daniel, or Daniel as he's called, is actually kind of a known figure in the Middle East, and he appears in other stories outside of Israel as a figure of, well, wise figure, has visions, has a connection with God. And it seems like a Jew was just using this character to describe what he thought was going on with the Jews 100 years before Christ, when at that time they were being oppressed by another group of people. Anyways, and they were being persecuted and killed. So he has these visions in the night, and one of the visions is of these beasts that are attacking the Jews. And these beasts are symbols probably of the various rulers surrounding them: Egypt, Syria again, the Romans, all the various empires around the time who were attacking the Jews or were oppressing them. But in the context of this vision, what's revealed to him is that God will triumph over all these other kingdoms. The Ancient of Days is kind of weird phrase. I think it's El Shaddai, which is translated Ancient of Days, but really it means like the God of the hills or something, the God of the mountains. But anyways, the eternal God takes up his throne. His clothing is as white as snow. Okay, so he becomes bright, very white. Remember, Ms. Jones, what you read from your version, King James version of the Transfiguration, when Jesus is transfigured, how is he described? That his clothes became white as anything, that any dyer could dye with bleach. He became bright white. Not Caucasian. Not like me. The color white. Like the Ancient of Days sitting on his throne in Daniel, right? And the books were opened. God is going to take an account and he's going to overthrow these beasts, these monsters that are opposing Israel. And then what happens in verse 13? I saw coming on the clouds of heaven one like a Baranash, one like a son of humanity. And when he came up to, apparently, God sitting on his throne, he received kingship. Oh, remember Basileia, kingship, rule, kingdom, what am I saying? And all nations will serve him. And he will have a kingship that will never be destroyed. Now, if some of this sounds familiar, remember when I was talking before about Jesus' trial, right, Ms. O'Brien? In the Gospel of Mark, Mark makes it very clear. What is Jesus' response to the high priest? Ms. Dumas, do you remember? No. All right. We're leaving early, Mr. Gaffney? What's up with that? I've got to get tougher on you people. I'm too much of a cream puff, Miss Miller. Well, let's look. Jesus before the Sanhedrin, Mark chapter 14. I'll read this. Again, the high priest asked Jesus and said to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Then Jesus answered, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." So he quotes almost exactly from Daniel chapter 7 of this vision. Yes, please do drive safely. I don't want you to get into any accidents so you can get to class on time. Not have any health issues that keep you away. So that's the blasphemy. He's sent from God himself. May even be God himself, because Jesus also is transformed into white light, and he also has a throne that he sits on. But that's neither here. That's other stuff. But he certainly quotes from this: "I am the Son of Man." That's how Jesus understands it. Now, if you read biblical scholarship, commentaries on the book of Daniel, it's not exactly clear what the Son of Man is referring to. Is it an actual person? Okay. Or is it a group of people? Most biblical scholars will tell you, no, it's not referring to a Messiah. It's probably referring to the whole group of people of Israel, that they as a group will be like the Son of Man rising up against the enemies of God. And okay, I can see that. And that might even have been the original intent of the author of the book of Daniel. But remember, the human author is one of the authors involved, but the other originator is the Lord. And he might have another message that's kind of running along with this, that there's a message at the time that the author wants to convey to his readers, but there might also be a broader message that God wants to convey. And certainly Jews who did read Daniel 7 later interpreted it as a prediction of the Christ. This was a prediction of the Messiah. There's what Daniel literally meant, but then there's also how it develops in the mindset of first century Judaism. So this, what does Jesus have to say? This is clearly a messianic prophecy for Jews of his time. He thinks that he applies it directly to himself. Even though he doesn't specifically ever say, "I am the Christ." He does say, "I am." Okay. But he doesn't go around saying this normally. But it's there, so it's there. Forget about the book of Enoch. That's just an example from something that was written just before the time of Jesus that gives the prophecy, interprets the Son of Man as the Messiah. Okay? And again, that's not worry about it. Talked about ransom. Don't worry. I was planning on, you go with me. Okay. So the Christ. Now, just like Mark says in the Transfiguration, Jesus mentions resurrection from the dead, and the apostles don't understand it, right? They don't understand it immediately. until it happens, and it's right, Miss Hoy. It isn't really. How's it going, Miss Hoy? Am I making your day better or happier? Or... Thank you, Miss Hoy. I appreciate that. That helps my ego. I like to think I'm making a contribution, Miss Peralty. What was I saying? Transfiguration. Yeah, they have to develop their, apparently, if I'm just reading the text as what the text is telling me, not even reading it as a faith text, just as a literature, the author, Mark, is telling me that there were some things that were not understood until way after the fact, until it all happened. Just like they like to do, again, go back to Hollywood films. Ever see The Sixth Sense? See the movie The Sixth Sense? Yeah. Shyamalan. It's on, I notice it's like on Hulu now because it's Halloween and it's creepy. I'm trying to think of a more modern film, but I don't know, because I'm dipping into my references and I get like maybe few of you know what I'm talking about. Yes. What? What does what mean in English? This? Why are you asking that question? Just out of curiosity. Huh? She's curious and she wants to know, Ms. Wanamaker. Mr. Palumbo, is that what's supposed to be going on in this class? No. Is that why you came to university? To satiate your curiosity? To gain some knowledge? Ms. Lacey, you're making me look bad again. All right? That's not my job. Okay? You're here to party and just get a piece of paper so you can get a job. Fake it till you make it. No? No, Mr. Engel? No. Well, you got to go somewhere else then.
I went here because there's no parties.
Really? It's not a party school?
I wouldn't like the plague. I'd rather have the plague.
All right. Well, you're just here to sleep, I guess. If you're not going to party, I guess you got all day to take a nap, live the cat life, and then get your paper and get your job. Fake it till you make it. All right, Ms. Lacey, there's Greek. I'm coming to that in a second. There's development. Okay? Not everything apparently was understood immediately. And that the gospel writers are okay to admit that. They didn't understand. They record what Jesus did. They're okay to say, we didn't understand what he was talking about when he told us this. Or Jesus did this, but it made no sense to us at the time. But then, after the resurrection, well, we still don't understand it 100%, but we understand it more. We understand it better. And that's okay. I don't think the apostles had it all figured out when they were around Jesus. I don't. I wasn't there, but I just from reading the Gospels, they tell me that. So just taking them at their word. So this statement, ego eimi, that Jesus also applies to himself. And apparently he did apply it to himself. Ego eimi is Greek. Ego, those of you who have taken Latin or exposed to Latin, you know this means I, ego, I, and me means am. Similar in English, right? We're related languages, same language family, Indo-European. I am. Ego eimi, okay? Ego sum in Latin, right? I am. Jesus, this is another expression that Jesus seems to have applied to himself. We have it in the Gospel of Mark, which is our earliest gospel. He says it before the high priest. And seems to mean it because the high priest reacts violently against it, as a Jew would have if you used the name of God. Certainly if you're applying it to yourself. And in our latest gospel, the Gospel of John, it's all over the place. Jesus is constantly using what are called I am sayings, which mean more than just I am this, I am the door, I am the good shepherd. Yes, okay, Okay, it's a copulative. You got to use something, right, Ms. Lacey? But other statements where he calls himself specifically, I am. He uses it as a name for him, which is a name for God. It's the name for God for the Jews. When God reveals himself to Moses in the book of Exodus, and Moses asks God, okay, you want me to go free the people from Egypt, the Jews from Egypt, but they might ask for proof, and they want evidence that I'm true. What should I do? I need to give them your name so they'll know that I'm legitimate. So what's your name? And God responds in Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Ehyeh, I am, Asher, what or who? Ehyeh, I am. What does that mean? Ms. Cottrell? We don't know. I said, well, what do you mean? You just said, I am who I am. Okay. How could you interpret that? Okay. I'm the source of existence. I am what I am. Okay. Period. Okay. But really what in the Hebrew, it's probably is like none of your business. It's a way of saying, I'm not going to tell you. I'll tell you a little bit, but not the whole, it's just like, you don't need to know my name. Remember when Jacob fought with, oh no, that's another one. So this becomes kind of the understanding of God's name. He is I am for the Jews. And you never say his name out of respect. Typically don't say his name. Even today, Jews won't say God's name. They certainly, a lot of times they won't say even the word God. They'll say something else. And you notice that Jesus wouldn't do that. Again, when he's in front of the high priest and he says, uses that prophecy from Daniel, he says, he doesn't say I'll be seated at the right hand of God. He says, I'll be seated at the right hand of the power. Okay, so he kind of, a little circumlocution. Even Jesus kind of respects that Jewish tradition, but he does use I am. So it's kind of weird, It's like, why would Jesus say I am and then be all kind of scrupulous about saying God? But anyways, so Jesus, this is another indicator of the language of Jesus, which I think seems to be legitimate to Jesus. It seems to go back to him because it is recorded from the earliest level mark to the later letter. John takes it and runs with it. He sprinkles this statement all throughout his gospel, maybe even in statements that Jesus did not use it. But he wants to hit you over the head with this, that, Jesus is divine. That's fine. But yeah, this is another thing. Now, do I think that they had it all figured out? No, these were Jews. It did not enter into I don't think it entered into their minds that a man could be God. Ever. It was totally outside of the realm of their theology. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about God later. God bless you all. See you next week. Have a good day, miss. Thank you. Son of man. Huh. That's him. Oh, here are the notes. Have a good weekend, miss. Thank you.
I have
Yes.
about the Bible.
Yes.
Okay, so are Christians supposed to celebrate atonement or like observing? Because I thought that was Jews, but someone recently that I know, like they say they're Christians and their church had like a whole ceremony for it.
There are some Christian groups, mostly Protestant groups of Protestant Christianity who believe that, because it's the law of God, it's still there in the law of God, and God says to celebrate certain festivals, that Christians are still bound to do it. The Catholic Church and the ancient churches, no, they've made a very early on in the history of Christianity. The ancient churches like the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodox churches decided that no, these Jewish practices practices of the law of Moses, like the temple stuff, was not required anymore. Mainly because the temple was destroyed. But even if the temple were destroyed, Jesus was the great high priest. He was the ultimate sacrifice.
That's why I was confused. So I'm not incredibly in my Bible, but I feel like I read enough.
Yeah.
And I know Jesus was sent as the ultimate sacrifice. So the law of the First Testament, it wasn't like mandatory for us to like to follow it.
Yeah. Now, it could have been mandatory because Jesus followed it, and we can follow the example of Jesus. But then again, there's his body, the church. And the question is, well, how did the church understand the will of Christ or the will of the apostles, who were all Jews as far as we know? And they were still going to the temple after Jesus. They were still observing the feasts. But the understanding seems to have been that, no, there were things that within Judaism that were no longer necessary, were not obligatory. Okay? There also was like some anti-Judaism going on and anti-Semitism. So they're like, we don't want to be like the Jews anymore, you know? Because you could observe these feast days if you wanted to, you know, and honor them, but they're just not part of the church's celebration anymore. It's all centered around the events of Christ himself. He is now our Passover. So we don't celebrate the Jewish Passover. In fact, it might not have even been a Passover meal, but Jesus gave it this. We don't need Yom Kippur or something to forgive our sins because we have Jesus. And he gave us the sacrament of penance, which forgives sins through the priesthood, et cetera, and so forth. So, yeah, the church, very early on, you see this in the New Testament with circumcision. You know, there's that question. It's all throughout Paul's letters, actually, a big controversy about whether we should still be circumcised. Jesus is circumcised. You know, he didn't say not to do it. Should we still do it? And the church had to make a decision and say, no, it's not necessary. So the same thing with the Jewish feast days, festivals. Now, there are some theological principle reasons why, having to do with who Jesus is. He's the fulfillment of the law. So the law doesn't supersede him. He supersedes the law. But there are also some just things like, well, we don't need to do these. They're not obligatory, so we don't have to do them anymore. So,
Okay.
you're welcome, Miss. Yes, Miss.